Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to this webinar series. This is part of the Understanding Global Gun Violence and Health series. This series brings together experts from diverse sectors to examine the state of the global impact of gun violence on public health. The objectives of this series are to really explore guns as a risk factor in the global burden of injury, understand the role in deepening health inequities, analyze prevention through legal frameworks, and reflect on how international policies and cultures shape health outcomes for all populations. So today's focus is specifically on pediatric firearm violence and prevention. This webinar series is led by Dr. Adnan Haider, Senior Associate Dean for Research and Innovation, Professor of Global Health, and the Director of the Center on Commercial Determinants of Health. The co-leads include Arturo Carrillo, who I'll be introducing shortly as one of our panelists, Dr. Babak Sarani, Chief of the Center for Trauma and Critical Care and Professor of Surgery and Emergency Medicine, and myself. Today's webinar is sponsored by the George Washington University Seminars Funding Program. So my name is Betsy Choma, and in addition to being a co-lead of this webinar series, I'll be today's moderator. I am currently an assistant professor at the George Washington University School of Nursing and a pediatric nurse practitioner for the George Washington Student Health Center. As a PNP and nursing faculty, I have the privilege of advocating for pediatric patients and their families, both in the community and at the bedside. My career is navigated by a commitment to mitigating the devastating effects of pediatric firearm violence through a blend of clinical practice, education, and research. So let's get started. I am incredibly excited about today's webinar and our incredible panelists. To introduce them, we have Dr. Annie Andrews. She's a pediatrician and mom who has dedicated her career to fighting for a brighter future for all children. She was a Democratic nominee in South Carolina's 1st Congressional District in 2022. Annie is currently a clinical professor of pediatrics at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where she cares for children and adolescents at Children's National Hospital. Annie is a gun violence prevention researcher and community advocate working to reduce the frequency of pediatric firearm injuries with a focus on secure storage counseling. She is also a senior advisor to Everytown for Gun Safety and Moms Demand Action. She is a CEO and founder of our nation's first and only political action committee for kids, Their Future PAC. You can hear more from Dr. Andrews about the intersection of kids and politics on her Substack, Don't Tread on Kids. Our next panelist is Arturo Carrillo. Arturo is a clinical professor of law and the faculty director of the Civil and Human Rights Law Clinic at George Washington University Law School in Washington, D.C. Arturo is a human rights lead at Global Action on Firearm Violence, a nonprofit civil society organization where he has pioneered research, litigation, and advocacy strategies aimed at promoting the firearms industry accountability for its role in enabling endemic firearm violence in the United States and abroad. In 2024, Professor Carrillo was named the Lancet Commission on Global Firearm Violence and Health. A dual national of Colombia and the United States, he is an international lawyer, advocate, and scholar dedicated to advancing the practical application of the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights to companies that manufacture, distribute, and sell firearms. Professor Carrillo is a graduate of Princeton University, where he received his Bachelor of Arts, GW Law School, where he received his JD, and Columbia Law School, where he received his LLM. So in order to really provide context on today's discussion, I'm going to provide a brief overview on pediatric firearm violence right now. So in 2025, we look at data from Everytown for Gun Safety, and this really looks at each state's gun laws. This data reiterates that states who have weak gun laws have more gun deaths across all populations. In June of 2024, the U.S. Surgeon General published an advisory report in which he declared firearm violence to be a public health crisis, stating it is an urgent public health issue that requires the nation's immediate awareness and action. An aim of this report was in part to depolarize the issue of gun violence by really taking a public health approach, mirroring what has successfully been done with motor vehicle crashes. Currently in the United States, firearm-related injuries are the #1 cause of death in all children from ages 1 to 19. Pediatric deaths from firearms continue to rise for many reasons, but in part due to weak gun laws, access, unsafe firearm storage patterns, and assumptions that children cannot access firearms. We estimate that there's about 4.6 million children in the United States that are living with a loaded and unlocked firearm in their home. It's also known that most children cannot distinguish between what is a real gun and what is a toy gun. We also know that from a developmental standpoint, children as young as the age of 3 have the fine motor capacity to pull the trigger. Finally, this Surgeon General's report highlights the disproportionate impacts of gun violence on younger populations and minority groups, specifically emphasizing the disparate impact of gun violence by sex and race. So we're going to go ahead today and start with our panelists. So we'll start first with Annie. So Annie, you've done so much work in this arena. Can you share a bit about your background and what inspired you to address pediatric firearm violence?
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and sorry for my camera being off. I'm a little under the weather today, but I would like to make some quick comments. One of the occupational hazards of being a pediatrician is your patients share their germs with you, and that's what's happened to me this week. But on that note, you know, my whole life was centered around a goal to be a pediatrician, and after spending 15 years working in that capacity at children's hospitals, I just grew increasingly frustrated at the systemic challenges that our nation's youth face, and in particular, the gun violence crisis that I felt like was being ignored. And when I thought about being a pediatrician, I envisioned a career caring for patients with asthma and diabetes and pneumonia, and I never thought I'd take care of so many children with bullet holes in them. And it really just takes standing at the bedside of one child who has been shot to motivate you to want to find solutions to this problem. And to the point that you just said, this is a public health problem, and our children are suffering because we've allowed it to become politicized and polarized. And our lack of action because of that has led to it becoming the leading cause of death for children in this country. And that is just such a tragedy on such a global scale. So I got off the sidelines after the Parkland shooting in 2018 because my oldest child was in kindergarten that year. And it was the first time as a mother in America that I experienced one of these mass school shootings as the parent of a school-age child. And I remember how I felt viscerally in the days after that shooting and just knowing that I needed to do more. So I joined Moms Demand Action and very quickly learned the value and power of my voice as a pediatrician, which is something that everyone here shares. If you work in any way in the public health sector, your voice is so valuable right now on this issue and so many more issues. So when I started to see that if I spoke up, people would listen and I could accelerate change in my community, in my state, and across the country, I just, allowed this sort of career pivot to snowball. And it's the most validating work that I've ever done. And we need all of our voices to combat this public health crisis. And the good news is there are evidence-based solutions to addressing the pediatric firearm crisis, solutions like secure firearm storage, child access prevention laws, universal background checks. So we know what the answers are. We just need to work together in concert to build a coalition that is powerful enough to enact these solutions so that we can have fewer children with bullet holes.
Thank you so much. So going in, a similar note, you worked really hard in your career to help pass laws to protect children from firearm violence. Can you think of some key legislative victories that you've seen in recent years and how they've impacted pediatric firearm violence today?
Yeah, so even though I do work here in DC, my primary residence is in South Carolina. So over the time I've been engaged on this issue in South Carolina, actually our laws have gotten weaker, unfortunately. We've passed a permitless carry law. We've passed, just a series of laws that have made South Carolina communities less safe. And that is deeply frustrating to me as someone who tries to convince my lawmakers to enact evidence-based solutions. But along that same time period, at the federal level, we passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act in 2022. And I think it's really important for people to level set because it's easy to say that nothing has changed, that we're moving in the wrong direction as a country on this issue. And there's a lot of validating points to support that. But it's also important to take a step back and realize that that's a big deal, that over 30 years passed and we didn't have any meaningful legislation at the federal level. And then in 2022, we did. And it was a bipartisan bill that, increased funding for community-based violence intervention programs and mental health support for children in schools. And it did a lot of things. And it's not even close to enough, but it's a really important step forward. And I think it's, in this changing political climate, it's really important for us as public health professionals to keep data at the center of what we do and to keep our patients at the center of what we do and to keep our focus on identifying solutions and withstanding changes in political climate to keep moving forward for our patients.
Yeah, that's really good advice. So in thinking about that, we think about laws that protect children from gun violence, but we know that they often face political and public resistance. I think you touched on this in your last question a bit, but given your experience, what are some of the main challenges you've encountered in your advocacy work? What advice do you have for solutions to help overcome? So I know you talked a little bit about this. Is there anything else you'd add to that?
Yeah, I'll just finish up by highlighting there's so many challenges in this work, but one of the things that we all have is our healthcare professional, our public health credentials. I had a very illuminating experience in South Carolina where over the course of 1 week, I went to the State House twice, once as a Moms Demand Action volunteer in a red shirt and once as a pediatrician in a white coat. And the conversations I had with lawmakers were so different when I was wearing that white coat compared to wearing that advocacy red shirt. And that really honed in for me how important it is for us to use the platform, the megaphone we have as public health professionals to have meaningful conversations with lawmakers. So I'd love to share more in the future, but thank you so much for having me today, Betsy.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrews. We appreciate having you on here. Excellent. So we're going to move forward with our next panelist and talk a bit with Arturo. So Arturo, I know you've done a lot of work in this area from a legal perspective, but we'd love to hear a bit about your background and what inspired you to really address pediatric firearm violence.
Thank you, Betsy, and thanks for having me as part of this seminar. Well, as you noted earlier, my background is in international law and human rights, and it's a perspective I bring to different areas of advocacy and activism. It wasn't until recently that I had the opportunity to really fully engage with gun violence prevention. It was about 2.5 years ago. I got a call from a friend, John Lowy, who was the legal director at the Brady Center for many, many years, and had just left to start a new organization called Global Action on Gun Violence, and of which I'm now a part. And at the time, he was just setting up this new organization to try to bring international perspectives and humanitarian, angles and sort of novel approaches, given just the frustrating experience of working in domestic U.S. politics. And he asked me at the time, do you think international law, you think human rights has anything to do in response, can be of help here? And at the moment, it caught me a little bit off guard because while I had followed the situation of gun violence generally and felt just like Dr. Andrews said, personally appalled and wanting to see change and even thinking about ways that I could plug in, it had never really occurred to me how that might happen until John raised this question very specifically. And I started researching and realized that while there hadn't been a lot done in the areas of international law and human rights brought to bear on the issue of gun violence in the U.S., there were some pioneers, but there wasn't a whole lot done. I realized, there's an opportunity here to engage, to contribute, and to do something about this problem, because so many of us sit on the sidelines and see it happen day after day. And so I seized that opportunity, and since then have been working closely with John and others to innovate advocacy on planes, transnational, regional, international planes where it hadn't been before, and try to bring more attention, more awareness, and turn up the heat on issues of gun violence prevention in the U.S. One of the first things that we did with John through my clinical program at GW Law was to think up a strategic litigation at the regional human rights level. So many of you know the Organization of American States is a regional intergovernmental institution. It has a human rights system that operates in the Americas through the Western Hemisphere. It's called the Inter-American Human Rights System. And the main body of that system is the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So John and I came up with the idea of bringing a lawsuit against the United States for its responsibility, complicity with gun violence. John, put me in touch with the Manny and Patricia Oliver, who are the parents of Joaquin Oliver, who was killed in the Parkland shooting of Valentine's Day 2018. which I'm realizing is an event that ties a lot of today's discussion together. And long story short, we put together a groundbreaking case that we filed in November of 2023. It's called the Lawsuit for Survival. It's brought on behalf of Joaquin Oliver, who was 17 years old at the time he was shot, along with 16 others at Parkland. And it alleges, U.S. responsibility for violations of his rights as a child, as a minor, but specifically the rights to life, to education, to family, and many others that are specific and special to children and minors in international human rights law. So that's how I got started, really. And with John have been doing a lot of advocacy alongside that, which I can talk more about. But I'll just sort of conclude by saying the international system, in particular the OAS, the Inter-American Human Rights System, have grown very deeply troubled by the situation of firearm violence in the U.S., are studying it, have received this lawsuit have convened hearings on the topic, and it's drawing more concerted attention from international and organizations and I think other places as well. So.
Great, Arturo, thank you so much. That was really insightful. I learned a lot about OAS as well. So my next question is like a two-part question to really think about. So as a civil and human rights attorney working with families who've been affected by gun violence, what are some of the legal barriers that victims' families face when seeking justice? How can this be addressed? And really, on top of that, what kind of challenges exist when we're trying to hold gun manufacturers, sellers, or even negligent individuals accountable for the harm caused by firearms, especially in the context of child safety?
Yes, that's a big question. I'll start, and then if I
And I can
miss
repeat any
something,
part at any time.
yeah, I'll start, and then if I miss anything, you'll hopefully, ask me to clarify or expand or whatever's helpful. Well, so the question, as I understand it, really focuses on access to justice and accountability for families and for families of victims of shooting and gun violence in the U.S. And so, in that, I'm gonna focus on the main areas of law that either enable or impede access to justice and accountability for these folks. I'm not going to focus as much on the legal regime that governs firearms manufacture, distribution, sale, and all the things, right, what we would call gun control laws per se, but more on sort of what you think about and look to if you suffer from gun violence. And so in that area, there are sort of three bodies of law in the U.S. anyway that kind of come to the fore, right? There's criminal law, there's civil or tort law, which is non-criminal, and there are consumer protection laws. And I'm actually going to start with the last one, consumer protection law. So every product that's manufactured and sold to the public in the United States is subject to some sort of consumer protection regulation, toys, anything, especially if they're directed toward children, kids, right? Except guns, right? Guns is the only sort of consumer product in the United States that's not subject to some kind of safety or consumer protection statute. In fact, it's specifically exempted from the Consumer Protection Act. The gun lobby succeeded in getting firearms exempted from all consumer protection. So there are no protections at all. And this is especially relevant when we're talking about safety, right? And we heard Dr. Andrews talk about safety, storage of guns, safety devices on guns. There's no requirement that they really have any kind of safety device that would impede unintentional or accidental shootings, right? So huge gap that contributes enormously to the statistics that you have mentioned and others that I can mention of death among children from firearm violence. In 2024, at least through November, there were 204 we call accidental or unintentional shootings. They're not accidental in the sense that guns are stored in unsafe ways, and right, but they're unintentional. I'll use the two terms interchangeably, although not everybody agrees with that. And these 200 plus shootings resulted in at least 75 deaths and 130 injuries. All of this among children, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. A lot of the statistics and information just isn't available. And as you mentioned, 4.5 million children are living in homes with firearms that are unguarded, unlocked, fully accessible. And so, these are the situations that lead to that are exacerbated by the lack of consumer protection law, right? None of this should be happening to this extent. I'll talk a little later about how these types of things also disproportionately impact children that belong to communities of color, something that the international community has shown interest in and that we've talked about. But so that's like the first area of law that you have to sort of talk, why is it not doing more to prevent? Once a shooting does happen, then, and now we're talking mostly about um, assaults and homicides with guns, right? Because I'm not sure if you mentioned, but most in terms of children and minors, adolescents, most deaths come from suicides, um, or unintentional or accidental shootings, and then assaults and homicides, right? I mean, so those three are the different forms. You probably could speak more to that than I. But if we just talk about assaults and homicides, that's where the criminal law comes in, right? And what you find is, that the numbers are vast. Between 2012 and 2022, nearly 20,000 children under the age of 17 died of firearm injuries or firearm as a cause. In 2021, guns killed approximately 4,700 minors ages 1 to 19. You talked about how it's become one of the primary causes of death of this strata, right? And these numbers don't even reflect the disproportionate impact it has on children of color. My children, African American children, Latino children. The disproportionate impact is especially bad on African American youth, who are 13 times more likely to be killed by a firearm than their white peers, right? Latino children and teens are 2 times more likely to be killed by a firearm than white peers. So disproportionate impacts, large numbers of children dying due to firearm violence in assaults, and well, that's generally right, but a significant portion of that number is for assaults or homicides. And the criminal justice system, sometimes works, but not always. I don't have all the stats on firearm violence, but what I do know that there are studies that show, kind of continuing with this theme of disproportionate impact on communities of color, that homicides in which victims are Black and the accused is white are 10 times more likely to be essentially adjudicated as justified, and there being no responsibility. There's a imparity in the way the justice system deals with firearm shootings of whites and Blacks, and that also affects violence against children, or where the children are the victims. Mass shootings, right? So this is another phenomenon. Parkland was a mass shooting. Gun massacre is another way of talking about that kind of incident. In those cases, the criminal law tends to work a little better, as far as I know, or as far as I can tell. Most shooters are either caught and punished, or killed, or sometimes they kill themselves. But as a rule, the criminal law does not always achieve justice in all cases of firearm violence is really the point here. And the more you go down the socioeconomic ladder and the more you talk about communities of color, the less justice there is. Even where the criminal law system does punish the perpetrators, and that is something that victims find, redresses to some extent the injury and harm that they have. I'm talking about survivors now, family members, or people who have been injured by firearms. It doesn't fully repair the harm, right? In order to to achieve a reparation for harm from firearm violence, whether you're a survivor or a family member of someone killed or surviving firearm violence, you need other means, other modalities, and that's where civil and tort law come in, right? So the criminal law punishes the perpetrator. Civil and tort law is intended to get at other parties that might somehow be involved, implicit, complicit, right, in the firearm violence. And I know I'm kind of going on here, but I'll try to wrap up this part, and then you can ask me some questions to flesh it out. But tort law or civil law, sometimes we hear it as getting at parties that have been negligent or reckless and caused harm, right? So, think about car accidents, slip and falls. That's tort law. But when you have reckless manufacture of unsafe products like guns, or marketing and distribution of them to folks who sell to the black market or to criminal elements, or other factors that contribute to gun violence by firearm industry actors, manufacturers, distributors, and sellers, that's where civil law and tort law in particular would come into play.
Okay.
In fact, in the early 2000s, there were dozens of lawsuits brought against manufacturers by cities and by states, precisely for this reason, feeling that the way that guns were being produced and marketed and sold were not taking into account the fact that they were getting to the hands of folks who shouldn't have guns, knowingly sold to people that shouldn't be buying the guns, and steps were not taken to stop that. And those lawsuits were getting traction. In the early 2000s, several of these suits they were started to advance. There were congressional hearings, and long story short, the gun lobby, the industry, the NRA, National Rifle Association, came in, lobbied Congress, and in 2005 achieved a statute that gave a kind of blanket immunity to firearm industry actors. That's the Protecting Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, PLCAA, or PLACA. So this is the law that shields firearm industry actors from civil lawsuits for negligence or reckless conduct that leads to harm, and that has, by and large, put an end to most lawsuits that victims and families of victims and survivors could bring to seek redress or reparations beyond what the criminal law does. Does that all make sense? I'm going to pause there and let you ask me any questions.
It does make sense.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And when I think about one of the challenges that I see from a health perspective, is 17 times the national average on healthcare expenditure. Is that covered under, would that, is that something that would be covered in a lawsuit as well, that they can help with that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question? I didn't quite
Yeah,
catch it.
when I think about the challenge, like a specific challenge I see in healthcare would
Mhm.
be there is a 17 times expenditure in healthcare, right? That medical bills and healthcare of lawsuit of, I should be more specific, of survivors of gun violence. So pediatric firearm victims who survive have an incredible increase in spending, mental health, physical health. And so expenditures, is that something that's covered under these lawsuits again?
Well, right. So yes, no, it's the Surgeon General's advisory report really underscores just the long-lasting effects on victims and survivors and their family members, and the cost to the economy of that. That's what you're getting at, right? From the health and the public health perspective. That is at least insofar as actual victims of gun violence and survivors, right? That would, if lawsuits could proceed under tort law in the way that they were originally in the early 2000s, before the PLACA immunity statute came into play, yes, those harms would be part of what the survivors would be entitled to, or the victims and their family members would be entitled to. It's precisely the law, acts to impede any lawsuit, and therefore anything that you could get from a lawsuit. In civil law, in tort cases, the outcome is, or what you're looking is compensation damages, right? It's money as a substitute, right, to sort of help redress the harm and the loss that you suffered. You can't replace a loved one who's been shot, but you will award something for wrongful death. You can't replace a limb or well-being generally, but pain and suffering can be compensated monetarily, and so that's what civil lawsuits and tort suits would have allowed, and were allowing to some extent before this immunity statute was put into place. And advocates like John Loy, my colleague and co-counsel, and others, continue to try to litigate cases on behalf of family members and survivors, trying to use the limited exceptions in the statute to get to get some sort of accountability. Those cases are far and few between. I'll just give one example. After the shooting in Uvalde, a lawsuit was brought, and there's an exception to the immunity which says that if the the actor being sued violated a law, state law or federal law, in a way that contributed to or caused the harm of in this case, the shooting, right, or the killing, then the immunity won't apply. And the theory is that by marketing to, certain young men that are known to be a sort of a type to become mass shooters, or to criminal elements, cartels, for instance, that might be involved, just in the marketing that targets vulnerable or dangerous sectors, that then lead to violence from those agents, those actors. The theory is the immunity should not apply. This exception of a violating another law would impede the statute from operating, and in theory, should be able to proceed with the case. Some cases are moving along, and increasingly more states are adopting laws that get at unlawful, reckless marketing like practices like this in ways that would allow lawsuits to get around the PLACA statute, the federal statute. So a little bit is moving there, but as a rule, you really can't bring these cases. And that means that families and survivors, especially with all the costs that you described that are involved, right, that come with surviving gun violence, just don't get addressed. They don't get resolved in the way that the legal system does for other products, right, or in other situations. So it's really a kind of a tragedy.
Wow, thank you. That's really eye-opening. I think I have a much better understanding of the barriers that really are in place there. And so just another question. So similarly, I think you started to touch on this, but I don't know if you want to go in further detail, because I know that it's a complex question and it could be a divisive one, but really think about navigating the complexities of ensuring child safety, right? How do you do that? How do you navigate these complexities, ensuring child safety without infringing on the individual's Second Amendment rights? Is there a way to kind of balance that? And how do you see that working?
Well, yeah, that's the million-dollar question. And it's sort of built into the broader question of just how do we address and think about gun violence in the US, and what, more, if anything, can be done. And Dr. Andrews was describing some of the challenges she's faced in South Carolina with legislators trying to get them to enact reasonable evidence-based measures to protect children. And it's sort of falls on deaf ears because, the culture in this country is one that is, historically and in modern times evolved into a very pro-gun rights sort of culture. And even just that term is the product of, a lot of efforts by lobby groups and industry groups to capture the narrative around how we view firearms and guns, and how we regulate them or not. And I can say a lot more about that, but I would say, in a nutshell, the first issue, in my opinion, is just this inability to enact sensible consumer protection laws around the manufacture and sale and possession of firearms, right? It should be regulated like any other consumer product, even more so than most others, because it is lethal by nature. And the fact that you can't convince lawmakers to do that, and that they don't see that they should do that, is really just a reflection of how deeply rooted this pro-gun culture is, and how far it reaches, and really the industry actors that feed it and promote it. The second sort of factor is, which is a manifestation of this, in my opinion, is also just the way that the law is evolved in this country, especially from the Supreme Court. I think you may have mentioned or alluded to certainly the Second Amendment, right? This idea that today, due to relatively recent Supreme Court cases, the right to own a gun for self-defense and for other reasons is considered a fundamental right, one that is anchored in tradition and history, and is therefore, Second Amendment unassailable under the Second Amendment, or difficult to limit under the Second Amendment. That was not the historical understanding of the Second Amendment. I'm not myself a historian, but I've worked with others who are, and for 200 years, the Second Amendment meant something else. It just dealt with a well-regulated militia, and there was no such thing as a fundamental right to own guns, unlimited or virtually unlimited as it is now. But that all changed in 2008, with the first case, Heller, and has progressively evolved since then to the point now where, at least in U.S. jurisprudence and in practice, and you have a fundamental right to own a gun, to carry a gun in many states. You don't have to register it. You don't always need a license to buy one, and really, it's largely unfettered, certainly compared to restraints that you see in other countries of some, sort of comparable countries, developed countries. So that's sort of a second factor. But anchoring all these sort of legal structures and developments that I'm describing is the social, political, and cultural foundation, right? The fact that it has become a part of our national discourse that you can't touch guns, and that there's an unassailable fundamental right to own them, to own as many as you want, and to own any kind of gun, including military style weapons, right? Not and I'm not saying that people can't or shouldn't be able to buy guns or own them or use them, but you don't see this kind of all-encompassing view or narrative, in the way that it happens here, in any other country in the world. And the U.S., and that's one reason why the gun violence in the U.S. is just multiples, more egregious than it is anywhere else, more common, more frequent, and more harmful than anywhere else.
Yeah, thank you, Arturo. That really kind of helps to frame what, how we got here, and what we're dealing with and all these different changes. So as we kind of move forward, I'm just going to ask you one more question, then we'll open up to some panelists to ask a few questions here. There's been a lot of changes over the last, decade, 20 years. It changes frequently. Are there opportunities? Is there an opportunity for change to really decrease firearm violence? I think Dr. Andrews alluded to this earlier, and unfortunately she had to step off. But what do you see as a possible opportunity for change the next decade? What gives you hope for the future? Is there something that we could really focus on that could potentially work towards decreasing these numbers?
Yes, there are definitely, avenues, that could begin to address gun violence and its impact on children and just and folks in general. Dr. Andrews mentioned the passage of the Bipartisan Safe Communities Act, the BSCA, which under the Biden administration, was enforced for at least a year after it was enacted. It did go a long way, to recognizing, especially some of the impacts at the community level and providing resources to address those. She talked a little bit about that. It also tweaked some of the legal requirements, to make, for instance, background checks a little more widespread than they had been before. They're still not universal the way they should be, but they're certainly better than they were before. The problem there, and this is true generally of what laws do exist to regulate guns, the Gun Control Act and other legislation, is the political will to enforce those laws and keep the worst abuses from happening. So, for instance, gun dealers that sell to straw buyers knowingly sell large amounts of weapons to folks who keep coming back and buying in bulk, right? Clearly, that's one person doesn't need 60 guns, so they're selling them on, right? And those end up in the black market, and a lot of the criminality comes from that, both in the U.S. and abroad. So, a lot more, enforcement of laws requires political will. I don't know that we are currently in a political climate where we're going to see continued or increased political will to enforce existing laws, BSCA backwards. But eventually that will change. Eventually, and maybe in certain places at the state level, you might be able to see some progress on enforcing laws, but it's going to be difficult because, this is a theme in my comments. The legal regime is in many ways reflects the social political realities of a country after a certain point, especially when you reach a critical mass, and you know and lawmakers, because of the general culture that I was talking about, just don't see curtailing gun violence as a priority because it means curtailing gun rights, and that's not something they can do politically, is what they believe, right? So a lot has to change. I do think the BSCA was a positive step, and it means that in the future others could be taken. There was an assault ban there was a federal ban on assault weapons for 10 years back in the naughties, I guess we call them now, right? And it was very effective at stopping violence, mass shootings, and other criminality, violence using firearms in the U.S., that kind of firearm in particular. And when it lapsed, all those indicators went up again. Again, Dr. Andrews mentioned this. We know what needs to be done to uh, curtail violence and to limit the misuse of guns. Steps that we're not taking, from consumer protection through gun control, through oversight, monitoring, licensing, universal background checks, all these things that we've heard about. I know you asked me to see if there was any. You asked me if there were any positive, pathways, and I think I mostly have not been positive, but it's not an easy situation, right? And yeah, so I think it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of education, raising awareness, being sensitive to the cultural issues, and trying to make people understand, the evidence-based, right, measures that are sensible, that are reasonable, and that work everywhere else in the world, but here.
I mean, I think I would disagree. I think you have given some positivity there because by, enlightening myself and other people who are listening to this, there's some barriers in place that I did not know exist. I see the healthcare realm, and I see the day-to-day, but from the legal standpoint. So I think as we start to have more of these conversations and we start to really understand the barriers, I think that's kind of working towards that. So thank you for sharing. I think that's a lot of great information.
Um, yeah, no, I also want to just highlight, as a positive trend that I'm seeing, is increasingly more collaboration across different sectors of U.S. society. This collaboration, public health and law, medicine, public health law. We can't just keep attacking or addressing this problem from our own silos. We need to join forces and learn from the perspectives and experiences of other areas and sectors and experiences. And I'm learning a great deal from you and others in the public health field, and that makes my advocacy stronger. And I'm trying to translate some of this legal, experience and insight into things that might be useful for you to apply in your work, right? That's part of what our collaboration is about. So I sense there's a coming together, that's happening as we speak, across sectors, across disciplines, across society, really. Maybe even bringing together folks who wouldn't otherwise necessarily be collaborating if it weren't for a shared concern for the impacts of gun violence on children, on minors, and on everyone.
Absolutely. No, incredible opportunity to really understand and to work across disciplines, and in this case, across university. Well, thank you so much, Arturo. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and open up. We have a little bit of time for some questions. So I'm going to go ahead here, and it looks like I'll read the first one. Let's see. So feel free to post any questions that you may have in the chat, and we're here to kind of stay.
I do see a question here about what will happen in the next 4 years, and I can just start that while other people think of their questions. I can, this is just my personal opinion, and I think others will have their own opinions. The incoming administration, certainly based on the first time, right, the first administration that they had, is not particularly interested in enforcing existing gun laws or enacting new ones. very much in the camp of the current prevailing understanding of the Second Amendment, which is very narrow and very not helpful to trying to enact reasonable, sensible, evidence-based measures to control gun violence, unfortunately. So, but even in that context, there is a potential for some progress. If you think about the first Trump administration, President Trump enacted an order that prohibited bump stocks, which were these devices that allowed semi-automatic weapons to become automatic, like the one that was used in the Las Vegas killing. And it was after the Las Vegas massacre of 50, plus concert goers. He realized that that was something that most people wanted and thought was sensible, and enacted a prohibition on an executive level, which then was struck down by the Supreme Court in a case. So there was actually progress, at least in that regard, for a moment, and then it was undone, by a different branch of government. All this to say that I wouldn't expect a lot of change, certainly in laws or in the lack of enforcement of those laws. That will probably decrease, given that the Biden administration did work to enforce some of those laws, including the BSCA that we talked about. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be a challenge. I think we need that coalition of voices that Dr. Andrews was talking about. We need people to come together and to be heard, and to start to get in the ear of lawmakers and policymakers and make them understand that, children's rights are not less important than gun rights, or people's lives are not less important than your right to, carry an arm concealed or something like that. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I think for sure. Are there any other questions? A little bit more time before the conclusion of this webinar. It looks like any major concerns about the future of research in this space, especially with NIH freezes and the like?
Definitely. I don't know, Betsy, you can probably speak to this as much or more as I. Most of my work doesn't depend on, well, that's not true. Until recently, most of my work wasn't dependent on external research funding. A lot of what I'm doing now, especially cross-disciplinary work, is, but just from the little interaction I've had with more conventional researchers, I think that yes, this is a definite problem, and there are deep concerns about that. Is that your experience as well, Betsy?
Yeah, no, I think that this is this is an evolving issue where I think that we are going to find out. I was just talking with a colleague about a grant that we are submitting for, resubmitting for this grant. And the question is, will this continue to be funded? What are the guidelines that are going to regulate this as we find out more information? So yeah, I think for sure this is a concern that we have and that we're monitoring. And it looks like the second part of the question is, are there any alternatives? And alternatives, I think, I'd have to really think about that part of it.
Well, it would have to be private sector funding. It would have to be philanthropies and foundations. They're going to have to pick up the slack, because you can pretty much say goodbye to any federal funding, I would guess. What I'm worried about isn't just the lack of funding, but it's actual steps to undermine research or to prohibit research. Laws that prohibit funding for gun violence and children, for instance, that were in place for a number of years. The Dickey Amendment, the Tyrod Amendment. It's just unconscionable that you would have a legislator prohibiting research and evidence gathering to improve, policy to the benefit of its population. But that's exactly what's happened here, and it's still in place, and it might even get worse. So, yeah, it's not looking great. I do think the private sector, I think, is going to have to pick up the slack, and we need to think about ways to broaden, I think, sources of support, and not just funding, but just general support across the board.
Great, well, thank you. And there's one or two more questions in the chat. Among the possible legislative reforms, there's one that's more likely to be enacted as a low-hanging fruit, more accessible.
That's a great question. I have not been following the legislative side of this is close enough to be able to give you a specific answer as to what that particular form might be, but that would be the strategy would be to think creatively about where there are convergence points. Um, I think this topic of pediatric gun violence and prevention is an area in which you might be able to establish alliances with sectors, conservative sectors of American society. Um, think about and advocate for sensible legislation, to address it. That's generally is like just an example of an area where I think there should be some way to come up with a reform like that. And there might be others. I think that is a great question, and one that advocates like us and others will need to think long and hard about in the coming months, because that's where we're at.
Yeah, and I think to add to that, when you think about states that have the really weak gun laws, you start to see that those are, though, and speaking with other consultants, those are typically are the states that are more likely to adopt policies in school districts, like every time for gun safety, and adopt, supporters to show that they are trying to, on the back end, support education in some way, shape, or form. So hopefully that continues.
Yeah, state level reform will be probably even more important than ever before in those states where you do have legislators who understand the problem, are willing to do the right thing, pay attention to evidence-based proposals. Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. And several of those states that were really, they basically get a grade A through F. And several of those very low graded states in the last report that just came out had improved significantly. So I think that is another positive to think about as well. It looks like there's another question. Other than delivery of care, what role can healthcare providers play in this debate to try to bring change?
That one's for you.
I will take that. So unfortunately, Dr. Andrews did have to step off. So we think about healthcare providers playing this debate. I think we share experiences. I think that we all have experiences in healthcare where we are, I'll go home and tell my family, okay, you are never XYZ because I just saw a terrible injury on this trampoline or whatever it might be. We see these kids, we see these families, and we share our personal experiences. We share the numbers. I think about the role that we can play. So my understanding of growth and development, I understand why kids are accessing guns and the sense of, they just honestly don't understand at certain ages. And I don't think that these are things that people think about. In some of my research, I've looked at, families and firearm safety education. And so much of it is when we talk about, do you ask about the presence of firearms? It's not so much that they want their children to play with firearms. It just never occurred to them that their child either knows where their household gun was kept or had the ability to access it. Even in families where they have these firearms, hidden away, that they think it's a safe place, over half the families, had no idea that their children know where the household gun was. And just bringing awareness that children are curious, and providing that information from my pediatric perspective. So that's my role in peds. I think you take an emergency provider, you're going to see a lot of these shootings. You look in mental health, the long-standing repercussions for families, communities. But I grew up near Parkland, and similar to Dr. Andrews, that was kind of, I played soccer there. That was like a rival high school of my high school. And that really brought me into the advocacy role. What can I do if this happens here? Gosh, this is really happening everywhere. And how do I get involved? But I think that when you look at your area of expertise, that in healthcare, we have so many different areas, and you bring that to the table, you talk with your lawmakers. Heard Dr. Andrews saying she wore her white coat and how influential that was. But hopefully we move forward in all capacities and really provide this information in a multifaceted way. Looks like there's another question. So what workable measures can be adopted to reduce the shootings in schools?
Well, I mean, again, these are beaten paths. The law, by which I mean that the laws in place to regulate who can buy a gun and when they can buy it. Even under the existing legal regime here in the U.S., if it was more actively enforced, you're not supposed to sell to minors under a certain age. You're not. You have to be a certain age to purchase a certain kind of gun. You're not, you're supposed to do background checks. These don't, that's always been a big factor. Folks with mental health issues, with criminal records, or that have some other sign that they are not really someone you should be selling a gun to, right? Uh, if those types of provisions could be implemented, actually made to do what they're supposed to do, and strengthened in some cases, so expanding background checks, for instance, that would go a long way in you know, sort of reducing the number of mass shootings at schools. Not making AR-15 military style assault rifles available to 18-year-olds is a really good place to start. Just the Parkland shooting is an example. That shooter bought several different guns, including the one used in the shooting that was this AR-15, had a history of mental illness that was not registered in a background check. All kinds of red flags had come up. As law enforcement, state and federal, did not act on tips, did not act on the safeguards that were in place. If things had worked the way they were supposed to, or the way that they could, in terms of safeguards and that the law envisions or could implement, Parkland would have been avoidable. And that's one of the tragedies, of that tragedy is that it could have been avoidable, and many others as well. So that's just a very short, sort of condensed version. But and if any, additional measures could be added, expansion of the definitions of what it means to not be fit to own a gun, licensing, registry of arms, red flag laws. If someone misuses a gun, it gets taken away. None of that currently exists. So.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, no, it sounds like there's a lot of paths that need to be properly, the channel would have to be run the right way, and if not, then it's not going to be effective.
Right.
Thank you so much. So we'll close here. Any other questions? We'll stay on for just a moment, but thank you all for your time. This webinar series does have a new webinar every other month, so stay tuned. We will be sending out information shortly on the next one, and thank you all for joining and for your attendance, and hopefully continuing to provide more informative education. Thank you so much, Artur. I really appreciate having you today.
Of course. Great to see you.
Thanks all.